Hey guys, hope this is working. I don't usually record on my laptop for videos, but and today's video is going to be a little bit more longer form than my videos usually are. So today I wanted to speak with you guys about something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and also that I think is an incredibly important conversation for us to be having. Well, at least those of us who participate in media democracy, which is most of us in 2020. So if you want to think about at a really, really high level, media democracy is essentially the transformation that we've seen take place for the media landscape. So if you consider the traditional dynamics of media, for example, in really simple terms, you typically had to have maybe a lot of money and a lot of the right contacts to be able to participate in media. And for example, you probably had to be affiliated with a mainstream media channel, such as, say, a Channel 9 in Australia or the likes. But what's happened is, particularly in recent years, we've seen the democratization of media, which has simply meant that anyone really across the globe who has access to internet connection, if you like, or mobile data, and can access certain digital platforms, say the likes of Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, and so forth, YouTube, anyone who's had access to internet connectivity, as well as any such digital platform, has been able to participate in the media landscape and, for example, create their own media, share their own media, and engage with media quite freely across the world. And this has been absolutely incredible for humans in general, and the development of business and social and health opportunities and so forth. Even if you consider the recent COVID-19 pandemic and what media democratization has meant in terms of allowing us to remain connected to the world at large and the important people in our lives. But anyway, I don't want to digress and start talking about something that is not what I actually came on to talk about today. So the reason we're here to have this conversation today is because in recent months, the Australian government has called on the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, in Australia to develop what they're referring to as the News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code, which is essentially being designed to address the bargaining power imbalance between digital platforms and news media businesses in Australia. Now, if you reference the details relating to this initiative, you'll be able to get the exact definitions of how they're defining a news media business and so forth, and what content assets for news media businesses that are eligible will actually be able to be governed and leveraged throughout the scope of this code and so forth. But I'm not here to discuss the particulars of the code, but I really want to just pluck out one key piece of information that's been raised in the scope of the code, and discuss that with you guys, because I think it's one of the most important aspects of this proposed code that applies to most of us across the globe, and is something really a little bit contentious, but also really, really important for us to explore. So within the scope of the proposed code, there are a whole bunch of minimum standards that will be required of digital platforms in order to be compliant with the code that will be governed by the ACCC. And one of these things relates to that of algorithm changes. So when you think about digital platforms, think about, say, the likes of Facebook and Google, which are the two initial digital platforms that the ACCC and the Australian government are proposing will be governed by the code, which means that, for example, say digital platforms such as LinkedIn and Instagram aren't yet required to comply with the code when it goes live. But what's important is that we acknowledge that this code and its success in being passed, if you like, will set precedent for the governance of other digital platforms in the exact same manner. So just because, for example, other digital platforms aren't included at the moment doesn't mean they won't be forever, right? So that's precedent, right? But anyway, so at a really high level, actually, I should probably share my thoughts on what I believe one of the biggest things that this code is really trying to address in Australia. And my understanding is that based on the language used by the ACCC and the Australian government throughout the particulars of the proposed specs of the code, is that this code really is working to address the fundamental issues, well, the fundamental failure, if you like, broken business models of news media businesses in Australia. That's probably the simplest and most straightforward way to put it. So given the democratization of media, that has threatened traditional news media business models across the globe, not just in Australia, but this code is working to protect Australian businesses in particular. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should ignore the broken business models that most news media businesses use in Australia, but what I do firmly believe is that the approaches being proposed are not the way forward to strategically support news media businesses in Australia, because this legislative intervention is really just a band-aid solution. It's not actually addressing the fundamental issues that are threatening news media business models in Australia or even abroad. Now, one of the key things that comes out of the proposed particulars of the code is something that I think is something we need to all be discussing. And to me, this particular aspect of the proposed code relates to what I'm interpreting as legalized insider trading. Now, if you read the details relating to the proposed code, you'll probably understand what I'm suggesting here. But one of the minimum standards of the proposed code is that digital platforms such as Facebook and Google will be required to provide a minimum of 28 days notice to eligible news media businesses under the scope of the code about algorithm changes that are going to happen that are likely to materially affect the business performance of those eligible news media businesses. Now, in really, really simple terms, what this means is that if I am an eligible news media business as decided by the ACCC based on their criteria, if I'm an eligible news media business under the scope of the code, that would mean that every time Facebook and or Google or any other relevant digital platform that can be governed by this code, anytime they're going to make an algorithm change that they know is likely to materially impact, for example, the performance of my advertising revenue on their digital platforms, they are required to give me a minimum of 28 days notice about that algorithm change so that I can prepare accordingly to try and preserve the economic performance of my advertising revenue on the respective digital platform. Now, call me naive, but my interpretation of this is that this is in effect legalized insider trading to provide preferential treatment to eligible news media businesses in Australia. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I am not suggesting that the government should not intervene about the bargaining power imbalance between digital platforms and news media businesses in Australia. But what I do believe is that actions like this are actually not in the strategic interest of news media businesses in Australia, and nor is it in the strategic interest of the media market in general, because using legislation to intervene with the natural forces of markets in a competitive market, mind you, when you're ignoring the actual fundamental issues that are challenging news media businesses, which is that they are operating in most cases on broken business models, you're not really addressing the problem. Instead, what you're providing is a band-aid solution that is surface level, and strategically it won't actually support the Australian economy and is probably more likely to do harm than any benefit. Now, there are certain aspects of the code that will require, for example, the provision to eligible news media businesses of advanced moderation tools. For example, having greater capability to, filter or remove or block particular users from commenting on content distributed by these eligible news media businesses. Now, I'm not saying that those moderation tools are not worthwhile, they're not effective, they're not justifiable, they are justifiable, but what you'll find is most major digital platforms in any case already provide capability to publishers of content to be able to block particular users, remove certain commentary and so forth. Or even Facebook, for example, I'm familiar with the fact that they have quite advanced capabilities, particularly for business pages, when it comes to filtering of, certain words and so forth. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but there was already a bill released, released by the Australian government, which was the Assistance and Access Act in 2018, that provides the Australian government themselves, through the support of their intelligence agencies, with greater capability to intervene in technological environments, for example, through digital platforms where they believe it is a matter of national, security or health concern, if you like. So anyway, I'm not going to go into the details of that for this proposed code, but the one thing I do want to highlight, which I think we all need to start talking about, is what does the minimum standard requirement of digital platforms to provide insider insight to eligible news media businesses around algorithm changes that are likely to materially impact the performance of those news media businesses? What is this suggesting? What message is this sending about insider trading in effect, which in the securities market is actually punishable by law in Australia? So I'd be really fascinated to hear everyone's commentary on this, because I think it's something we should be certainly talking about, because legislation like this code is not going to slow down or stop the democratization of media. It will not stop it at all. It will it's just you can't stop the democratization of media, and unless you're going to make innovation in the media landscape completely illegal across the world, I think this code and some of the proposed particulars will actually do more harm to the Australian media market than it will do benefit. And I think the Australian government respectfully should also seriously consider the message they are sending to people who operate from an innovation perspective in the media market, and what message they're sending to independent, distributors of media and information and so forth. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. On the 28th of August, public consultation submissions are no longer going to be accepted by the ACCC within the scope of this code. And what that means is up until, I believe it is the 28th of August 2020, you are able to submit any sort of submission to the ACCC in relation to the particulars of this proposed code, which they will consider when they do all of their formalities around this proposed code. So anyway, long story short, I believe everyone should be talking about this. I believe everyone should be thinking about what this means for them, particularly if you do operate quite proactively in the media space from a business standpoint. So for example, if you're currently in Australia and you are operating a social media marketing agency, well, this code is going to impact you. Of course, if you are an eligible news media business under the scope of this code, it may benefit you, but then you also need to consider what that actually means from a competitive standpoint on a global scale. Because if, for example, in Australia, you are protected by a certain code that allows you to, for example, preserve your advertising revenue results for your clients, but then globally you can't compete at the same level because you don't have legislation protecting you, think about how you're going to manage your expectations with clients in that respect, and if it's actually going to be beneficial for you long term, particularly if you are working to build a globally competitive business, which most social media marketing agencies, for example advertising agencies, are working to do, because we all know that a big part of media democratization has meant that no longer are we constrained to localities and geographies. Media and digital platforms in particular have actually enabled us to compete on a global scale when we usually otherwise couldn't have in many cases. So anyway, that's it from me today, but I encourage you all to think about this. If you do have an invested interest in this space, I would encourage you to visit the ACCC's website and potentially share your thoughts in a respectful and thoughtful and deliberative manner with the ACCC ahead of August 28, because this is certainly a code that will have some immediate impacts, but I think the most significant impacts will be longer term, and we'll see them come into effect and sort of impact us all in a sort of elongated manner, if you like. So anyway, I'm Sally A. Illingworth. You can catch me more routinely and in shorter form on the LinkedIn platform.